Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
How's everybody this fabulous morning? So good to see you guys. So we've got so much to talk about, so many interesting issues today. Let's begin by thanking God for the gift of learning Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. So Jewish texts are just so interesting, and synagogue texts are just so interesting, and the order is just so interesting. Last week, you will remember that we looked at the Haftarah for Parshat Mishpatim, and it takes us to the end of the story of the first temple, to the destruction of the first temple. And for those of you who were not here, and if you were here, just a brief refresher. The prophet Jeremiah explains the destruction of God's house at the hands of the Babylonian army by saying that this is all because of Jewish slave labor. Rich Jews owned poor Jews. And God, who took us out of Egypt, does not like slavery. God does not like slavery. And the noble people and the rich people and the haves in Jerusalem had released their slaves, and then they reneged, and then they reclaimed their slaves. And this got God so ticked off that God sent the Babylonian army to destroy God's house, because God was so upset that Jewish slave labor was still operating in Jerusalem. That's the end of the story in 586. That is the Haftarah from Parshat Mishpatim 2 weeks ago. Now, with perfect irony and a great sense of complexity, which is why it's worthwhile to be a Jew and study these texts and go to shul and wrestle, the very next week deals with what question? The building of the temple. That same temple that was destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians on account of the fact that there was Jewish slave labor. Well, the next week's Haftarah is the building of that house, the building of that temple. But guess what? Guess who builds the temple? Jewish slave labor. Jewish slave labor. And here's what we're going to see. What we are going to see is that King Solomon becomes Pharaoh, and he enslaves Jews to build a big project. And the Torah, and lest you think that I'm some funkadelic MSNBC progressive woke person, you will see that the biblical pshat, that when you look at the words, and I'm going to cite you two proofs, that the biblical view is that this house of God was built by slaves. And we're going to see that the same word is used to describe the Jews who built the house of God for Solomon as the Israelites who built Pitot and Ramses for Pharaoh. Same word. And then we're going to see that this is all as the prophet Samuel had predicted, that a Jewish king is going to enslave his own people. So you end up having this irony that when the temple is destroyed in 586, it's destroyed because Jewish slaves are still operating. But when the house of God is built to begin with in about the year 1000, it's built by Jewish slaves. And so what you have here, and this is the subject that I want to talk about, is moral blind spots. How it is that you can be a religious personality, how you can be focused on God's laws and Torah and mitzvah, etc., and still be a shmo, still be immoral. You could pray morning, noon, and night and still be a shmo. And apparently, the ultimate source for this is God, God's self, because God does not seem to see in this Haftarah that God's house is built by slaves. And then what I want to do is, there are obviously so many contemporary references, but I want to share with you also this a work by two thinkers named Jason Reynolds and Ibram Kendi called Stamped, which is came out in 2020, and they talk about how a lot of the clearly racist ideas, like Africans are just inferior, or God wants Africans to be slaves, etc., that those ideas occur in the sermons of preachers. So you have religious preachers preaching slavery, again, an example of moral blind spots. And so I just wanted to, and I think the address for blind spots, moral blind spots, is the Haftarah that we're going to look at today. So I'm going to ask Sean Sander. Sean, thank you for hosting again. And Rhiannon, my colleague, is co-hosting with him. So thank you both, Sean and Rhiannon. Sean, if you can screen share page 2 of the handout that I had sent to you. Or Rhiannon, if you can sit. Okay. So go to page, so here we go. Okay. So the Lord had given Solomon wisdom as he had promised him. There was friendship between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. Hiram is going to be important because he's going to provide a lot of the raw materials for the kingdom. Okay, now, King Solomon imposed forced labor on all Israel. The levy came to 30,000 men. And then he sent them to Lebanon. You can see it in shifts of 10,000 a month. They would spend 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Solomon also had 700,000 porters and 800,000 warriors in the mills, apart from Solomon's 3,300 officials who were in charge of the work and supervised the gangs doing the work. And then you get a sense, a second, the king ordered huge blocks of choice stone to be quarried. Solomon's masons, Hiram's masons, and the men shaped them. Thus, the timber and the stones for building the house were made ready. Rhiannon, can you please go back up again? Go back up to the top of the page. Thank you so much. Perfect. That's good. That's good. That's good. Now, it sounds like the translation sounds like forced labor. Okay, but let's look at the Hebrew. Vayal hamelech Shlomo mas mikol Yisrael. Vayehi hamas shaloshim elef ish. Now, one of the principles of interpreting Torah is that you want to look at words in one context the same way that they're used in other contexts, and they shed light on each other. So, Rhiannon, if you can please turn to page 5 of the handout. Page 5. And that's perfect. Thank you so much. This is early Exodus, when the story of our descent into slavery and the beginning of it happens. And now you have Pharaoh. Vayasimu alav sarei misim laman anotav b'sivlotam vayiven are miskanot lafaro at pitom vet Ramses. So this is a new, and previously it's a new king who rose who did not know Joseph, etc. And then, you know, we've got to watch out for this minority, these Hebrews. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pitom, and Ramses. So you see that the Hebrew is sarei misim, taskmasters, laman anoto, to torment them, besivlotam, with forced labor. And mas is the exact same word. Misim is plural. Mas is singular. Misim is plural. In other words, and by the way, the context makes it clear as well. You have a king, Pharaoh. You have a king, Solomon. You have a building project, Pitom and Ramses. You have a building project, the house of God. You have slaves, namely Jews, and slaves, namely Jews, building a building project, sarei misim, or mas in singular, for a king. Now, I'm going to take some comments in a second, but I want to give you a second proof text. And Rhiannon, if you could please go to page 6. So this is from 1 Samuel, and if you go down a little bit more, so we can, go so that we can see more of that page. Perfect. That's good. That's perfect. So the people are rejecting Samuel the prophet, and they want a king, and God doesn't love having a human king because God feels replaced, and Samuel certainly feels replaced. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who are asking him for a king. Okay, so this is the prophet speaking in God's name about what happens if you get a king. And Solomon is a king. He said, this will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He'll take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as his chiefs of thousands and of fifties. Or they will have to plow his fields, reap his harvest, make his weapons and the equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers. Then he will take your male and female slaves, your choice young men, and your asses and put them to work for him. He will take 1/10 part of your flocks, and you shall become his slaves. Va'atem tihiyu lo la'avadim. And Eved Avadim, you remember the Pesach Seder? Avadim hayinu, the Pharaoh b'Mitzrayim. Same word. You are going to become Avadim, slaves to Pharaoh. And then you remember that in the Exodus story, the people cry out to God. They groan, they moan, they cry out. And verse 18, the day will come when you cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you on that day. Uza aktem bayom hahu. You're going to cry out because you are oppressed. So, Rhiannon, if we can go now back to page 2 of the handout. And now I'm going to pause for comments, thoughts, and questions. But perfect. That's perfect. So what Samuel prophesies, speaking in God's name, which is getting a king is a bad idea. He's going to make you slaves. You can see that all of that comes to pass, and it comes to pass. Jewish slaves are forced labor, and they build the house of God. Okay, so I want to just, and also I just want to note the paradox that last week we looked at the Haftarah from Mishpatim, and it says, oh my gosh, slave labor, Jewish slave labor, that's why God is destroying the house of God. And in this week's portion, Jewish slave labor builds the house of God. Rhiannon, if you'll just go down a little bit more, 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 go down. Okay, so pause, good. You're going to see in a minute that the author of this text, or God, or whoever it is that you want to say wrote this, seems to be blissfully unaware of this contradiction. And we'll look at that in a minute. But first, if we can go back now, Rhiannon, to the whole full screen now. Rhiannon, if we can go back to the full screen. In other words, you don't have to screen share anymore. If you can go back to the full screen, please. Right, if we can go back to the full screen. Thank you so much. Okay, so I want to just pause here for questions, thoughts, and comments about what we've seen so far. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Did you ever notice or realize before that the house of God was built by Jewish slaves? Kind of like Pithom and Ramses. was built by Jewish slaves. So what do you make of that infelicitous fact? Any takers? Well, okay. Quiet group. So here's what I want to throw out there. And I think this is just so important. And I want to name it, and you're going to see it in our own country. Moral blind spots. That's what, to me, the lesson is. And if anyone has a better lesson, I'd love to hear it. But God seems to have a moral blind spot. And Solomon seems to have a moral blind spot. And the writer of this text seems to have a moral blind spot. And the fact that Jews are enslaved to build this holy work seems not to bother them. And the question that raises is, how could that be? And what does that say about human nature? So let's just pick up for a second. Rhiannon, if you go back now to page 2 of the handout. And that's perfect. Go down so I can see chapter 6 of that. Perfect. Okay, perfect. Stop, please. Okay, so now what we've just seen this thing, what is the text going to talk about now? Like, the modern reader is kind of puzzling about how could it be that slaves have built this? Is this a question that the biblical writers asked? In the 480th year after the Israelites left the land of Egypt, in the month of Ziv, that is the 2nd month, in the 4th year of the reign over Israel, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord. The house which King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. The portico in front of the great hall of the house was 20 cubits long, along the width of, keep going, the house, 10 cubits deep to the front of the house, etc., etc. Now, it seems like they care a lot about cubits. The modern reader is thinking about slaves, and the biblical writer is just thinking about cubits. And I'm thinking, I don't care about cubits. I care about slaves. So there's an ongoing contradiction. And then just, Rhiannon, as long as you're here, keep going down to the end of the page, just to finish off the whole irony of this whole thing. This is the end of the Haftorah. Okay, so we have part 1 is it's slaves. Part 2 is no awareness that it's slaves. Instead, it's cubits this, cubits that. Then the end. Then the word of the Lord came to Solomon, with regard to this house you are building, if you follow my laws and observe my rules and faithfully keep my commandments, I will fulfill for you the promise that I gave to your father David. I will abide among the children of Israel, and I will never forsake my people Israel. So, and now, Rhiannon, you can come back to the gallery of faces. Thank you. So it ends with this admonition, please observe the laws of the Torah. Again, without any particular awareness that it was slaves who built this. And I'm not quite sure how to interpret the silence of the crowd, but I find it striking that 2 weeks ago, last Tuesday, we looked at the Haftorah, in which God seems very exercised about Jewish slave labor. And then in this week's Haftorah, 1 week later, seems oblivious about Jewish slave labor, talks about cubits and talks about observe the laws. And I'm wondering what any of you make about this contradiction. And then we're going to pivot to the American story, where you're going to see, same kinds of moral blind spots. So anyone want to observe anything about this text?
Paul has his hand up.
Who does?
Paul.
Paul Kalis?
Yes.
I can't see it, but I'd love to hear you, Paul. Oh, there you are. Yes, I see it now. Yes, Paul.
My thought is that this demonstrates the power of culture. And if the culture at that time was that slaves were used for almost everything, in order to make life easier for the slaveholders, that they would use them to build anything that they could. It could be a bridge, it could be an aqueduct, it could be a synagogue, it could be really any architectural any piece of architecture.
Okay. Paul Kalis, is it the job of religion on a good day, to challenge culture when culture should be challenged?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
that's why the religious project is worth it. Otherwise, you might as well be at the mall. By the way, I went to the Chestnut Hill Mall on Sunday afternoon. It's back. You could not find parking. So if religion is not going to help you transcend the moral defects of a society, why bother doing this? But the whole point of religion is this is a whole other source of wisdom and teaching and ethics and morality that will make for a better and more worthy life. It's something that you can't get at the mall. And so I think you're absolutely right, Paul, that culture and context do shape religion and sometimes limit religion, but it is worth pointing out, and this is the constant struggle, that the purpose of religion is to challenge culture when culture should be challenged.
Also, religion at that time was interpreted differently than religion of this time.
Right.
And I don't, just based on what you've shown, I don't think that Solomon thought twice about doing it. This is the modus operandi.
Right. So now here's my question to you, and we'll come back to this question. What are our blind spots? That's, to me, where this whole Haftarah lands. It's not about the building of the temple 1,000 years, in the year 1000 BCE. It's about Solomon, and the author of this text had a moral blind spot. And the question is, what are our moral blind spots? What are we not seeing? What is it that religious life is not equipping us to see that we would want to see? So I don't want to answer that quite yet, but I think that, Paul, is exactly the question that comes from this Haftarah. What are our own moral blind spots? Let me just, Rhiannon, will you turn to page 7 of the handout? And this is from the book Stamped by Jason Reynolds and Ibram Kendi. And they, for some reason, this is not oriented so well, but I'll just read it. These are ideas that appear in the pews of American preachers, and particularly Puritan preachers. And you've heard about them, like, those who went to Harvard and went to Mather House. Mather is named for Puritan preacher, and Cotton Mather used to preach all this stuff. Africans are savages because Africa is hot, extreme weather made them that way. Africans are savages because they were cursed through Ham in the Bible. They're savages because they're an entirely different species. There's a natural hierarchy, and they're at the bottom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that occurs in preaching that was offered up on the Sabbath day in New England. By the way, not in the deep South. That is, in New England, these ideas were offered. And then, Rhiannon, if you look on page 9 of the handout, you see about some of the complexity of Thomas Jefferson. And I'll just read a paragraph or two. When it came to Black people, Jefferson's whole life was one big contradiction. As if he were struggling with what he knew was true and what was supposed to be true. In 1784, he moved to Paris. His wife had died. His old Monticello home suddenly felt pretty lonely. He was exhausted from his grief, the years of being hunted by the British. He did what he always seemed to do in moments of crisis. He ran to France. As soon as he made contact with the French foreign minister, he sent word home to his own slaves to speed up tobacco production in hopes that the French merchants could pay back British creditors. On one hand, Jefferson was telling his slaves to work harder. And on the other hand, he was telling abolitionists that there was nothing he wanted more than an end to slavery. And while he was busy playing the good guy, promoting, defending, and ensuring that the French knew America was becoming America, back home, there was a convention taking place in Philadelphia to talk about the new Constitution. And then he ends up talking about the 3/5 compromise, where Black slaves were considered 3/5 of a person. And this book goes on about that. So back, Rhiannon, if you can go back to the full screen. So you see that the idea of moral blind spots, all men are created equal, that the author of that had a moral blind spot, the founders had a moral blind spot. And I think that, in other words, you could be Thomas Jefferson. You could be the author of the Declaration of Independence. You could be the founders of our country. You could be the authors of the Constitution of the United States. And evidently and obviously, we now know, have deep moral blind spots, just as in this Haftarah. So my question to you is, what does all of this say to us about our own moral blind spots? Anybody want to offer any thoughts? Please, Dottie. And Dottie, if you can unmute, please.
Okay,
Good, now we can hear you. Thank you.
I just feel that from day one, before King Solomon, they were always slaves. And through the history, not of our nation, but of the whole world, slaves have been the conduits who the people achieved whatever they wanted. It was like it was a done deal. There were slaves, there were people that would do this few, and today it's even prevalent in other countries, the way people are treated. I think that morally, this is something that I shouldn't say this, but I don't understand why God has not wiped this out.
Yeah. So, right. So I want to deepen the conversation by suggesting, at the risk of going where angels dare not tread, and to be equal opportunity. I think this problem of moral blind spots is a significant problem for our congregation and for our country. And I'll give it to you from both sides. Okay. I know people who are not disturbed by January 6th because they don't want to think about January 6th, because they think the other way, because Trump moved the embassy. And they don't want to think about the subversion of democracy because he's good for Israel. Right. And so when you say, but what about trying to overturn an election? What's that going to do to our democracy? They can't see it. They have a moral blind spot. Like the fact that there are swastikas and Confederate flags and nooses on the Capitol is reasonable political discourse, legitimate political discourse, only if you have a complete moral blind spot. And by the way, it's not just like crazies in the red heartland. There are plenty of Jews in our community who look the other way at January 6th. They don't want to hear about January 6th. Stop with the January 6th. He's good on Israel. That's a moral blind spot. And on the left, I think it's unconscionable, literally unconscionable, that in a week when China is being the host of the Olympics and the eyes of the world are on China, and they're literally putting their Muslim minority in concentration camps, that Amnesty International says nothing about that. And when Russia has massed its troops on the border of Ukraine, Amnesty International says nothing about that. And instead, it focuses on Israel. Why Israel? Why Israel? And people on the left say, well, whatever, but they're right. Israel is, committing problems against the Palestinians, and they have a moral blind spot on the obvious Jew hatred that underlies that. So evidently this is not such a popular topic because I can't get a word from anybody, but I'm just telling you that what's going on in this Haftarah is going on in our country, in our congregation, on all ends. The right can't see insurrection and subversion and anti-democracy and fascism for what it is because Trump is good for Israel. And the left can't see Jew hatred for what it is, selectively prosecuting Israel and giving China a pass and giving Russia a pass and giving Turkey a pass. They can't see it. And so we have a problem of moral blind spots. Elise Friedman.
I think it's not that we're just fine with all of this. I think that most people, like myself, I'm completely overwhelmed by it. I'm overwhelmed to the point where I don't know anything that I could do to make things changes. I look at the news every morning and throughout the day, and it seems like it's one thing after another, and it's just out of control. And I can't answer your questions because I don't know. I can't think of what to do.
Thank you, Elise. Ellen, and then Maddie.
I agree with Elise that would certainly be my first reaction, in that it's so worrisome and frightening that I'm just probably I don't know what to do, and it's hard to think about. Having said that, on the left, I think it's an issue of the book we read, Everyone Loves Dead Jews. On the left, I think it's simply, Israel and the Jews are always at fault. That's somewhat simplistic, but that's my attitude towards the left. The right, and those of us in the congregation who think that Trump is good for America or the world just because he moved the embassy. It's hard for me to express politely in words how I think about that. That is so short-sighted. What about our democracy? What about our children? What about our grandchildren? There is more in the world than Israel, although I love Israel, and who knows, I might have to run to Israel, and my children and grandchildren too. I don't understand the right. I don't understand, as Elise said, I don't understand. I don't know what to do. And I'm paralyzed. You're muted. You're mute. I can't hear you.
I share your concerns, and I share your feelings. And I just share the question about people who call January 6th legitimate political discourse. It feels like we don't inhabit the same world. It feels like we don't inhabit the same world. And it's hard to figure out what you do when you don't inhabit the same world with your fellow citizens. Maddie Donoff.
I couldn't agree more with what Elise and Ellen just said. My frustration is also that I've tried, Bruce says that I'm being very naive, but I'm trying to have some discourse with people who speak to the other side, and they won't. They will only give me their rhetoric, and it's almost like it's sort of canned speech. And when I've made points that I think are really important, they refuse to respond. My last discourse was to say to someone, the right side is saying that we're responsible for the pandemic, and our drones have caused the forest fires in California. And their response is, what do you mean? I never saw anything like that. So I think we're really in a very hard place in not being able to have a decent conversation with people who don't agree with us.
Yeah. I want to, and I'll take other comments. I guess what I want to ask in the spirit of the prophets who give us these haftorahs is kind of a response to Elisa's comments, which is, I think she takes in a lot of us when she says she doesn't know what to do and it feels overwhelming. What is a path for hope in this world beyond just loving our little zip code in Newton and Temple Emmanuel and our family and our friends and never actually leaving the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? Beyond that, what is it that we can do to be helpful to this conundrum? Linda Leffert, your hand was up.
I was just going to say, I've been thinking that I don't even know if I would call it a moral blind spot. I think if you think another way to look at it is people just being selfish, just what is good for them at this particular time. They convince themselves it's okay. There wasn't, I'm not a student of the Bible, but as far as I know from what you're saying, it doesn't sound like at the time there was this controversy, this rabbi saying this and that rabbi saying that, or whatever. It had been done before. It was good for them. It was a way to get it built. It was the practical thing to do. I don't think of it so much as a moral blind spot, as just selfish, self-centered. It was what's good for them at the time. It doesn't sound like there was any big debate about it. I'm not a student, but I know that there's no lack of treatises and tractates, written, about, I remember one of them was just whether it was Jacob or whether that was really his concubine or whether it was someone else, and the most convoluted explanation that somebody came up with to make it okay about whether she was really in that bed or not.
Right.
And here's something about hundreds of thousands of people, and you don't see, apparently there's not a whole lot of or any discussion about whether it's okay. So I think it's just being somewhat selfish and doing what's the pragmatic thing to do at the time.
Thank you, Linda. Charlene Finkel.
Oh, good. I wasn't sure you saw me. I'm having trouble. Well,
Yeah.
I know what we can do. We can stop buying things from China, because what we're buying from China is being made by people who are basically in concentration camps. So how many of us are our shoes come from China, so much of our computers. So if everybody in the United States decided not to buy those things, that would be a wonderful boycott. But we're selfish. How many of us are going to do that? I mean, you look at your clothes, where do they all come from?
They come from Amazon.
Yeah, where does Amazon get them? From China.
Right.
I heard that all our shoes are made there. Or sneakers or something. And so when we say, what is it we can do? That is one thing, and none of us are going to do it.
So Charlene, where does that leave us? Looking at this world, looking at Elisa's question of feeling overwhelmed by these pathologies in our society, on the left and on the right, what's your helpful response or hopeful response?
I agree with what Elise says. I feel the same way. I feel like, what can I do? And so I think that is the dilemma. We can belong to organizations, we can sign things, we can donate, but in order, there's now an organization for older people that I was reading about it in the New York Times. And this man has started things for, my nephew just sent it to me. Codger something, I don't know the name he gave it, but action that older people can do if they unite. I'm talking about the environment. I know you're focusing on Israel, which is certainly on my mind, but I think if we got together, there are some things we could do. That's not a very good answer, but I do think in terms of, there's just so many issues. It's not only Israel, it's not only racism. You know, like I hear Elise, where do you begin? So my thought is that each one of us should take one or two things that are extremely important to us, if we could number them, which is almost impossible,
Right.
and find an organization that has meaning to us and get involved with those organizations. That's.
Thank you, Shirley. I think Annette Miller was next, and then Connie, and then Elise. Annette Miller, Connie, and then Elise.
Unmute, just, okay. Hi, thanks so much. I think the quietness is that in the past, there's always been that you kind of, when you don't know what to do, you kind of look to Torah for examples of right and wrong, how they argued about something. And I think that the stillness now, for me anyway, I can't speak for everyone else, is that I have no place to look. If my past is saying that, yeah, there wasn't even an argument here. There was just this blind spot. God had a blind spot. All is well with the world. The temple is rebuilt. And so that's all that's important is the edifice, and people will have a place and go through ritual, and God will take care of you. So I really don't know. I mean, I think we're better off now because we're at least questioning. We're saying, what can we do? And in the literature that will come along, hopefully it will say at this period in time, there were groups who were questioning. We have other examples of that in the Talmud and the tractates, but I don't seem to see one here. And yeah, in our Constitution, I think it's great. I mean, we have amendments and we have started, it's taken years, and we called out, we recognized what Jefferson did was good, and we called out what was bad. Do we take down the Jefferson Memorial now? I don't know. So I think that the only hope might be is in the education and in the questioning for what we're doing here. I'm very upset about what's happened with the amnesty, of course. And yet, I am upset at what was going on in Israel with the demolition of housing. So yes, call out everyone, call out China. Don't just pick on Israel, but doesn't get us off the hook. I'm not off the hook with what's happening here in Israel. And I'm still angry and it's worse, the fact that that Amnesty International, in its usual way, did not point out what's wrong with anyone else and has only pointed Israel.
But by the way, Annette, that points to my own blind spot.
Mm-hmm.
In the world as it is currently constituted.
In the what?
In the world as it is currently constituted, with 1930s style Jew hatred running rampant, with Amnesty International giving a pass to China and giving a pass to Russia, giving a pass to everyone, I can't engage what Israel is doing wrong. That's my moral blind spot, which is not to say that Israel is not doing anything wrong. We all are challenged. Certainly America is abundantly challenged. Israel also has its challenges, but the environment is such now that it's just not a fight I'm willing to have or engage. And I don't feel safe for Israel having it. There's so much mob hatred for Israel that I can't have a conversation about house demolition. I can't see that. That's my moral blind spot. In a different now, which is not to say that there's not an issue with house demolition. Your grandson was emailing with me. I'm sure there is some issue with house demolition, but the current infrastructure, the current landscape, with so much hatred towards Israel and so much hatred towards the Jewish people, and Israel being a convenient way to express Jew hatred, a socially acceptable way to express Jew hatred. I cannot engage that question. That is my moral blind spot. Annette, did you want to say anything in conclusion?
Oh, I just think that, so what are we learning? What's the learning? The learning is we all have moral blind spots. And two wrongs don't make a right. And yet one has to pick and choose in life. And yeah, I'd certainly pick and choose what's going on in Israel to what's going on in China. And I'm very concerned about Jew hatred. And I want to be on my guard about that. And so, you know, is it that same thing? Two things at once. Yeah, watch out, you know, don't point the finger at me. I know what's wrong. I'm going to work on that, but you work on the rest of the world. I mean, how about this? How about we work on our own blind spots and defend, you know, I guess it's two battles at once, or something like that. I don't know, but I am, you know, disturbed at it. And someone once points out, I just quickly want to say, when the psychiatric profession had problems, the Boston Psychoanalytical Institute had problems in, I don't know when it was, the 90s or something, with, and they called in a PR person to help them work out the problems, because all of psychiatry got a bad name because a whole lot of psychiatrists were doing a lot of bad things with their patients. And the PR person came in and said, well, one way to start doing better work is to look at your own community and to like make sure your doctors are not misbehaving. So, I mean, that was one way. I don't know. No, they're pointing the finger at us. It's terrible. Anti-Semitism is going on. So I'll point the finger back at you. Blind spots. Oh,
yeah.
yes.
Thank you. Connie, and then Elise, and then I think Lillian. Richard. Connie?
Well, you begin by accepting what's shocking is that God has moral blind spots. Then you have to accept that everybody in the world has moral blind spots. So then to me, it feels like the work of living is struggling with the moral blind spots. And that is life. It's just an inextricable part of who we are as human beings and what the quality of life is on this earth. So it's almost like an acceptance of what's evil in the world, and it's our job to perpetually struggle with it. Well, sort of like Sisyphus, I think.
Yeah, kind of what I love about what you just said is at least we would be aware of our moral blind spots. I think being aware of it, living with an awareness that I have moral blind spots is a better posture than being unaware that I have moral blind spots. So
and that God does.
Yeah, and even God does. Yeah. Elise?
I just have one short recommendation for people who are in our quandary, and that is sending postcards to voters. I've sent hundreds and hundreds of postcards. I feel personally responsible for the election of Ossoff and Warnock, because I wrote so many postcards for them. But at least when I'm doing something like that, I feel that I'm putting the right people in the places where they can do something positive and stop the monsters. That's what I have to do.
Thank you, Elise. Richard Gray.
Yes. Hi, thank you. I guess I feel as though we have a lot of institutions that we've created to represent us, like the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, the ACLU, APAC. And I think maybe, I mean, to me, it's looking at their blind spots. I have a very hard time supporting APAC because of its blind spots to compromising America for the sake of Israel. I have a problem with the American Jewish Committee because they don't seem like they're adversarial enough. They're trying to be nice guys and influence people. I think the ACLU is representing me probably pretty well because they are adversarial. They go out and they speak, you know, they make lawsuits. They do things at the best we can to meet the other side where it is and to try to, well, to be, I guess adversarial is I think a level, but and looking at the blind spots of these institutions.
So Richard, here's my question. I mean, that's what your words were about, a critique of other organizations. My question is, what can you do? What can each of us do?
Well,
I mean, it's easy to throw grenades at other institutions. They do this, they do that. They're too adversarial, they're not adversarial. But my question is, when you wake up in the morning, what can you do to make changes of the kind that you want to see?
I can write notes to APAC and to American Jewish Committee and to ACLU, telling them my position, and I can back it up with my funding. And
Okay.
I think that's a pretty strong way. And I can ask Temple Emmanuel to also look at the institutions that it sponsors and that it supports.
Well, that's very good, because the institution that we sponsor and support is Temple Emmanuel. So we don't give tzedakah at other organizations. We're a shul, and we try to be a marketplace of ideas to to a broad array of ideas and speakers. Debbie Ginsburg.
To digress, on a local level, it seems that once or twice a week, we read in the newspaper about anti-Semitic graffiti.
Yes.
It was 2 times in Newton, in Marblehead, well, I don't even know the percentages of Jews in these cities, but clearly there's a big Jewish presence. And other than contacting your school committee members with outrage, I mean, how do 4th to 8th graders know that much about anti-Semitism? Are they getting it at home? It was either on or around the Universal Holocaust Remembrance Day. But why is it occurring with 4th to 8th graders? I mean, to me, that was shocking. What can we do about this?
Yeah. Okay. So I wanna try to find legitimate hope in this picture. Now, I'll give you the prophetic message, which is very common. It was in the Haftarah last week that we looked at last week from Mishpatim. It was also in the Haftarah for Yitro, and it's really not a very inviting look, which is both Isaiah and Jeremiah say that our world is so screwed up that here's what's going to happen. 90% of our world's going to be destroyed. Both of these. This is check out your Eitz Chaim Chumash. They both use the same word, Shemema, which means desolate. That Isaiah says this after Yitro, and Jeremiah after Mishpatim, which we saw last week. The world's going to be basically 90% destroyed because of all the tensions we can't solve. And there's going to be a 10% saving remnant, and we're going to begin again with the 10%. That's a prophetic move, and that really doesn't work for me. And that really doesn't work for us. It's on the books, but it's not a very good move. Now, the response, so what's a response that could work for 100% of us, not for 10% of us? So one response from, if you look at the Torah readings that we have now, is V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, which is build a sanctuary, and I, God, will dwell among the people. I will say that response works pretty well if you're in that sanctuary. I mean, I'll just tell you that, last night, cold winter night, we had like 35 people in the evening minyan, like real energy, real pulse. And people daven, and then they stay and they connect and they talk. And the same thing in the morning. This morning, real energy, real people. So it makes, at least when you walk into that sanctuary and you see other people, you feel the presence of God. That is a great way to begin the day and end the day, and make you feel like there's sanity and goodness and anchoring in the world, as well as all the craziness. But that just deals with our own little zip code. The larger issue that we're left with is how do we change the world? And I don't have the answer, but I just wanted to surface the question. I am finding now that I very much channel what Elise says. When I read, every day there's another story. Like last night before I went to bed, there was a story about how John Roberts and the three liberal justices wanted to stop Alabama from limiting Black people's rights to vote. And the other 5 justices said, no, we're going to let Alabama limit Black people's right to vote. And I don't know what you do with that. I don't know what you do with that. I mean, what I do is go to shul in the morning and go to shul at night, but how do you actually affect that world? And how do we deal with the moral blind spots that would allow that kind of problem to happen? So I will just say this, and here is my Haftarah legitimate uptick note, which is that this seems to be a troubled season, but I think we're still better as the Jewish people than we have ever been with all the problems that we have. We're certainly better than we were 100 years ago. We have Israel. I can tell you, ironically, when you go to Israel, and I was in Israel, as you know, there's a lot of energy and a lot of vitality and a lot of strength. Israelis, by the way, Michelle pointed this out in our Talmud class, and she's absolutely right. Israelis are not sweating the Amnesty International report. Americans are sweating it. Israelis are just living their lives with a lot of energy and strength. And for all of our challenges, our community here in North America has strength and energy and resources and a voice, and we use it. So our problems are real, but I suppose here's my prophetic best note that I can offer. It's been worse for the Jewish people. It's been worse for the Jewish people. We're actually better off now than we were pretty much any time of our history, particularly the 20th century. So let me give you your homework, which is to find your strength here. Find your anchoring in your own zip code, in your own hometown, in your own home shul, and then figure out how you can radiate that healing out into the world that needs it. Thank you, guys. See you next Tuesday. Bye.